So hello everyone, I'm Matthew Taylor, I'm the RSA's Chief Executive, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for today's very special event. Before we begin, a reminder that we're filming today's event and live streaming over the web, so welcome to everyone watching online. And a reminder that the hashtag is RSA Power, if you'd like to get involved in the conversation on Twitter. So we really do have an extra special guest for our conversation today. It's my great honour to welcome Samantha Power to the Great Room stage. As you'll know well, Ambassador Power is a Pulitzer-Prize winning author and leading global voice on human rights and international affairs, who served for 4 years as President Barack Obama's human rights advisor, and then from 2013 to 2017 in his cabinet, and as the youngest ever US ambassador to the United Nations. She's now Professor of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard and joins us today to discuss her new memoir, The Education of an Idealist, an absolutely gripping read in which she transports us from her early childhood in Dublin to the streets of war-torn Bosnia to the White House Situation Room and the arena of high-stakes diplomacy, where she battles to advance the cause of human dignity while grappling with the competing demands of idealism, pragmatism, commitment, compromise, and also having a young family. Ambassador Power, I think you want to start off with a reading from your amazing book.
Great. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be here in London and look forward to our discussion. So I am grappling in this book with all kinds of competing demands, and I thought I would read a passage that reflects just how much most people have going on in their heads and their hearts at the same time they're trying to do their day jobs. In my case, it's slightly removed maybe from everybody's experience, but the story that I'd like to share with you is of being President Obama's human rights advisors before I became UN ambassador. I was dispatched twice for him to Burma, Myanmar. In the first instance, it was just before the November 2012 election. And I was tasked with trying to convince Aung San Suu Kyi, who had just been released from house arrest, whose party had just done incredibly well in the election, but who herself, of course, was not yet, and still to this day, is not allowed run to become head of state. But nonetheless, she was clearly the person sort of driving so much of what was happening in Burma and Myanmar, or at least the progress that was being made. She was driving it behind the scenes, and President Obama wanted to become the first sitting president to visit Burma. I was dispatched to meet with her to convince her that that was a good idea. We had a very difficult meeting where every time I tried to open my mouth, she cut me off and I couldn't get a word in edgewise. She disagreed vehemently with him taking the trip, feeling it would legitimate the military regime. I tried to explain that we were going to use it as leverage to try to secure additional political prisoner releases, to try to secure a whole host of concessions. I was unpersuasive. The meeting went extremely poorly. It then was capped off by me raising the plight of the Rohingya, which we now know, of course, is not her strong suit, but I didn't know that at the time, but it was very, very difficult, terrible conversation. So that was trip number one. Trip number two then, just before Obama would go to visit, and she had lifted her objection, I was to go and to negotiate with the military regime to actually secure concessions so that the trip would be about more than a photo op, that it would be about actually bringing something good to Burma. I had just had a child in June of 2012, and this is November 2012. Okay. As planning for President Obama's visit progressed, Aung San Suu Kyi came around to supporting it. She was focused on her own political fortunes and saw the domestic benefits of embracing the occasion. Unfortunately, her rivals in the military government refused to agree to a set of reforms that we'd hoped to announce before Obama arrived. So a few weeks after my initial trip to meet with Aung San Suu Kyi, the president asked me to return to Burma and lock down our desired terms. I would have just 3 days there to forge an agreement before Air Force One touched down. On the flight over, I carried 3 items of critical importance: a thick briefing book that I consumed during the 20-hour journey, a notebook where I mapped out the concessions I would be seeking, and my breast pump, which would help prevent my milk supply for 5-month-old Rian from drying up on what would be my second lengthy trip to Burma in a month. Over 3 bruising days of negotiations, I secured a communique that contained a powerful set of commitments from the Burmese government. The final agreement included a large additional release of political prisoners, access for humanitarian workers to war-torn ethnic areas, and permission for critics of the Burmese dictatorship to return from exile or to travel outside of Burma. After Air Force One landed at the airport in Rangoon on November 19, 2012, I received a large hug from Tom Donilon, the normally undemonstrative National Security Advisor. He was elated with the terms. "You belong out in the field," he declared. Walking by, Obama stopped to congratulate me on what he called nice work. Having just won re-election 2 weeks prior, he was the most relaxed I'd seen him since before election night in 2008. I hurriedly thanked him for making the trip and thus giving me bargaining clout, but he waved me off. "Let's not kid ourselves," he said. "I'm only a prop." When our convoy arrived at Aung San Suu Kyi's home a few hours later, she seemed extremely happy to see the president. He too was moved to be in the place where she'd effectively been imprisoned on and off for 15 years. She welcomed us into her book-lined study, greeting me as if we were meeting for the first time. Obama began by expressing his admiration for all she'd already achieved for democracy in Burma. "How can we be of further assistance?" he asked. Instead of answering Obama's questions, Suu Kyi spoke for the next 20 minutes about the arcane procedural maneuverings that dominated the Burmese parliament. At various points, I looked toward Obama, wondering if he was disappointed or bored, but he didn't seem to mind her journey into the weeds of Burmese politics. Halfway through their allotted time together, Suu Kyi asked to meet alone with President Obama and Secretary Clinton. I was immensely relieved for an excuse to leave the room. I had not had time to pump for hours and had grown increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting went on. I raced out to the armored vehicle where I'd left my pump and asked to be directed to the nearest restroom, which was on the ground floor of Suu Kyi's home, across the hall from the study where Obama, Clinton, and she were still talking. This may be TMI, what's coming, but I perched myself on the closed lid of the toilet, assembled the breast pump, and then attached the suction cups first to a pair of bottles and then to myself. When I turned on the pump, it began its loud, rhythmic blare. Hee-haw, hee-haw. So what I've learned since the book came out and I've read this passage, or people have engaged me on the passage, is every woman thinks their breast pump is saying something else to them. Like it's like a secret language where there are these conversations that are happening. But anyway, mine was just saying hee-haw, nothing more profound. Initially, I was self-conscious about the noise, wondering if Obama, Clinton, and Suu Kyi might be able to hear it. But a large press pool from all over the world was milling outside, creating a din that I was confident would drown out other sounds. I took in the utter improbability of the moment. Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States, had just been elected to a second term by a sizable margin. Aung San Suu Kyi was a free woman and a member of the parliament from which she'd been banned for decades. And I, the mother of 2 children who had successfully negotiated with the Burmese military junta's representatives in advance of a presidential visit, was pumping in the bathroom of the home of a human rights giant. I looked up at the ceiling and said a short prayer of thanks. At one point, I thought I heard the chatter of the media die down, so I assumed that Obama and Suu Kyi were about to begin their press conference. I leaned over toward the window in the bathroom, which was beside the toilet, and I pulled back one of the curtains to see if this was the case. To my surprise and horror, the window looked directly out onto the porch, where the 2 leaders were already making statements to the cameras. Had I unwittingly drawn the curtains a few inches wider, I would have exposed myself to the world. Thank you.
So there's kind of over 500 pages of stuff like that in the book. It's absolutely enthralling. Ambassador, I don't really read biographies and autobiographies because I have this kind of slightly pompous view, which is that it's a kind of inefficient way of collecting facts. And so reading your book was kind of unusual for me. What it made me think was there's this peculiar thing now, which is that on the one hand, I defer to you enormously, and I wish I'd read this book when I was 20. I might have made something of myself. You know, you're a completely inspirational figure, so I'm kind of down here looking up at you. On the other hand, I know so much more about you than you know about me. So, I've got the upper hand as well, really, because the book is full of, this stuff. Why did you want to write it, and why did you choose to write it in such a kind of open way? I mean, not just this, but there's a whole section of the book about how challenging you found relationships before you met up with our good friend Cass Sunstein, good RSA friend. So why did you decide to share all that stuff?
It's the right question. I mean, I don't know that this book would look this way or have taken this form if, for example, Secretary Clinton had been elected president. I wrote this book in the shadow of current events, shall we say generously. And I think that we're at a moment where we're not listening to one another all that well. We have each of us, including me, we have our fixed positions. I believed, and now very much believe, that had I written something that was sort of explaining why I think my worldview is preferable to, shunning diversity and shunning allies and shunning values and shunning human rights, I would have been writing that for people who agree with me already, and maybe that's in the end who'll read this book as well. But to tell just a good story, I'm originally Irish, and there were two sort of dimensions of being Irish that were at war in me as I was writing. One was, like, you can't get a word in edgewise at the dinner table if you can't tell a good story, and you lose the attention of even your parents if you trail off or if you don't get your punchline just so. And so that was sort of the inner, from Ireland originally, and I felt compelled to try to tell a story that zoomed and that people would want to be along for the ride on. But there's also a saying that Irish people have trouble using the first person even in therapy, and I definitely found the I initially just extremely presumptuous to write a memoir. Especially one that went back to my Dublin childhood, that went back to being a war correspondent. It was one thing initially when I began working on it, I thought I'll write in the first person because I'll tell a better story that way. I'll overcome that barrier, but I'll only do so in a way that's kind of as it relates to Barack Obama, because Barack Obama is who people are mainly interested in. But then I realized you don't actually care about the character of Samantha if you don't know why she believes what she believes or what drew her to this person, this historic figure in the first place. And so the upshot was, in the end, I felt I needed to go more personal to make the character that happens to be me more relatable. And particularly, you mentioned, yes, I talk about my failed romantic journey, prior to meeting Cass. I talk about IVF and fertility. I've given you one of the most graphic scenes of the book here. But beyond that, I talk about my doubts along the way. And that, as I began to write, came to feel like one of the most important dimensions, because what's happened is, since I had the privilege of representing the United States on the world stage and representing, again, a figure like Barack Obama, I have found myself become less relatable to young people. Like, in other words, I might say, here's an idea for how one might go about progressing in the next phase on LGBT rights. And I see my students looking at me thinking, yeah, well, that's easy for you to say. You're the former UN ambassador. You can get a New York Times op-ed published. Like, what's my role in all of this? And so by going back to the beginning and by being very open about me asking myself those questions pretty much at every stage. I mean, even Barack Obama has asked himself those questions of, what can one person do? I think that's where people are right now. And so meeting people where they are, in a place where they are activated, a bit horrified, not sure whether anything that either an individual or their set of friends can make a dent in what ails us. That's been the story through human history. But most government memoirs don't open up the inside. I have a saying that actually comes from AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is never compare your insides to someone else's outsides. And so what I tried to do in the book is put the insides out there so that people who are asking themselves every day, am I going to activate or am I going to change the channel and watch something other than Brexit, just watch sport or just listen to my music? I want them to know that you're not alone, and that we do have a collective action problem. If everybody gets paralyzed by their smallness, we'll be where we are and worse with time. And so that was the enterprise, and so far, at least as it relates to the young people who I've engaged on the book, I think it has achieved that purpose of rendering the larger story of how to make an effort to try to make a difference relatable, and something that people feel that they too can do, that you don't have to be UN ambassador to do your thing.
So when you talk to young people and they aspire to be change makers, is there one lesson you want them to learn more than any other, or maybe one lesson that you wish you'd known from the very beginning?
I mean, what I'm about to say is a little bit counter-cultural right now, or at least in the States, maybe here as well. But I have this expression that I've borrowed from some behavioralists, from a book that Cass introduced me to called Switch, the subtitle of which is something like Making Change When Change is Hard, and it's by the Heath brothers. And they have this concept which is shrink the change. So the reason I say it's countercultural, the idea of shrinking the change, is that in our politics in the States at least, we're at a moment where there's great impatience among progressives especially, and even for the people who voted for Trump on one level, with the pace of change, with incrementalism. But the shrink the change idea is simply that if you set your sights on meeting the world's biggest problems with big transformative solutions in the first instance, you are likely to set yourself up for disappointment, and again, a kind of doom loop where then you're like, well, why bother? If I'm trying to solve climate change or mass migration or inequality or racial injustice, that's pretty hard for one person to feel that they're going to make a major dent in. And so, again, the temptation can be to try and then to be quite disillusioned with one's potential impact. And so their idea is, what is the small thing that you can do that makes some modest difference for someone? And I read this book when I worked at the White House and was all guns blazing, because I'd been an outsider, and here was my chance as an activist within. And I thought about it, I thought, this is so much more actionable for me and my team. And so I passed this book Switch, all around. When I was UN ambassador, we did retreats where we used their ideas in order to formulate kind of game plans for what we were going to do next. And so as we sought, for example, to make a dent in the human rights recession that exists around the world, we're now in 2019 in the 13th straight year of freedom in relative decline around the world. But that was happening when Obama was president as well. But instead of saying, as a human rights-minded person working for the superpower and working for President Obama, I'm going to solve the human rights recession around the world, I just sat down with my team and I said, what can we do? How are we going to shrink the change? What is something really modest that we can get done that will then inject some confidence into the work that we do going forward and show other countries what can be done? And so we came up with this really modest idea, which was to run a campaign which was called #FreeThe20. And it was just about deciding upon the names of 20 female political prisoners around the world. And each day for 20 days, leading up to a summit that President Xi of China was planning to chair at the UN, we would profile one of these women around the world, in China, in Ethiopia, in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, Venezuela, you name it. And we would hang a jumbo portrait of one of these women in the window of the US mission to the UN, facing the UN. So as the dignitaries walked by, they would see their political prisoners, very activist-y in a way for government. We would use social media. We actually managed to get the Democratic and the Republican female senators in the US Senate to get behind this campaign, and we were already then at a time of such polarization that for them to agree on anything was something of a miracle, but they rallied behind it. And in the end, over a matter of months, we were able to secure the release of 16 of the 20 women, which is no big deal in a way, and yet for each of those women and their families and their communities, it's the universe. And the sort of spring in the step of the young civil servants and foreign service officers that I worked with on this campaign, or even the ambassadors, the US ambassadors in the countries where we were lobbying on behalf of these women who had initially been very reluctant to have political prisoners from, quote, their country in the campaign because they were worried it would, be not helpful, as they put it, in our diplomatic dealings with the government in that country. The pride they took in having a hand in something concrete, because especially with issues like human rights, it can often feel very abstract. The human rights recession can feel abstract. You can feel removed from the people who are getting locked up because civil society doesn't have the space that it once had. But so too, even the victories can feel very remote and very long-term. And so that's just an example, and I think I didn't think in those terms when I was younger. And today, many of the people activating in American democratic politics don't think in those terms, and that's okay, because we need our compass and our lodestar and the values that we want to drive us in the long term. But even if you're for Elizabeth Warren, one of the more transformational candidates in the Democratic primary, you still have to figure out how to raise $100 or how to canvass, or what the small piece of the pie is for you in order to bring about somebody who you think is going to be transformational. And so it's basically don't make the best the enemy of the good on one level.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember Cornel West and Roberta Unger in their book, The Future of American Progressivism, said that the fault line between realists and idealists is one of the big things that holds back progressive politics. That's kind of really interesting that you say that. Now, you brought up in Ireland and you've come to Europe a lot, so one of the things that you kind of be aware of is that sometimes attitudes to America are a kind of indicator in Europe of your kind of views, and in a sense, the more left-wing you are, the more skeptical towards America you tend to be. I'm kind of interested in that's a big story in the book, it seems to me, because you come to America, and the way America welcomes you and the way you integrate so quickly is a really big part of your story, something you're proud of and something you're grateful for in America. But then as a journalist, and in your Pulitzer-Prize winning book, Problem from Hell, you're very critical of America, you're very critical of its policies. And then in the book, there's this moment when you are having the congressional hearing, and you have to do all the preparation for that. And as I read this is a kind of patriotism test. You've got to, what you're being told by your advisors is you mustn't say anything that's critical of America in this context. You've got to be. So then in the book as well, your kind of language, the way you talk about America becomes much more kind of patriotic. You're part of an administration you're very proud of. So you've kind of been on this journey about your own attitude to America as a country. And I'm kind of interested now in your kind of third life, as it were, as an academic, going back to that. But where are you now in relation to your own kind of feelings towards America? I mean, it's a very big question, I know, but...
Well, I mean, maybe I just push back a little bit on it's interesting the way you read it. So there is this exercise that you have to go through to become, for example, UN ambassador, but a senior political appointee of many kinds. You have to seek Senate confirmation. And so I had written so much that was critical, for example, of the Bush administration's policies on torture, or the invasion of Iraq, or sort of the obvious things that one would be critical of. And so I was, in effect, going to be asked to renounce some of the generalizable things that I said. For example, that America should apologize for crimes that it committed, abetted, I forget what some other verb. And so, when I went through this exercise of, they do these things called murder boards, where you practice for the questions that you're going to get when you go before the Senate. And so in my murder boards, there'd be someone like my husband, Cass, would play Senator Rand Paul, and he would start by saying, knowing it drives me crazy when people do this for no good reason, but I just hate it when people put an S at the end of my name. So Cass would say, Miss Powers, for which crimes should America apologize? And I'd be like, and then everybody on my team would be like, no. Like, this is not the time to establish world historical truths. This is the time to get confirmed so you can go and promote human rights and be part of the internal debate in a more senior position than you currently have. You know, this is a time, you know, to make some compromises to the system, to accommodate the system, shall we say. And so, you know, I describe, as you say, this exercise of kind of getting, you know, beaten back in my desire, and I, in the end, succeeded in not renouncing anything, but also not satisfying anyone, including myself, through the process, but getting through. But I didn't feel, either in the book, it's interesting if it comes across differently than I intended, but you know, there are many compromises that one has to make when one goes from being an activist to being inside. Me changing my view of America was not something that I felt happened to me. Now, that may be the classic blinded by one's own, you know, presumptions about oneself and so forth. But I felt that my self, 8 years into the Obama administration, was very continuous, older, you know, had seen more, knew about more places, had definitely made mistakes, but that my view and my ability, which may stem from my childhood, but may just stem from other things, but to see America from the inside and the outside, that I hadn't lost that ability, and that meant seeing it warts and all. And so, for example, yes, I was part of the Obama administration that became more aggressive in the reliance on drones. I didn't cease to be the person I was when George Bush was using drones. I just I wasn't going to be out at the press stakeout talking about, you know, my views and concerns about dimensions of that program. I write at length about Syria and, you know, try to bring readers into the dilemmas that we faced in dealing with the largest mass atrocity in the world since Rwanda, and even grappling with the question of whether I should resign because, you know, maybe in asking the question, would that do somehow more good? Would that be a jolt to the system? Would anything good come out of that beyond me feeling for 5 minutes as if I'd done something large in the face of something diabolical, namely what the Syrian government was doing. And so, you know, I think I retained my critical faculties. Having an Irish family who keeps you honest and you know, challenges you is part of that, but also building a team around me of people who weren't lifers, you know, having the best, I think, of the Foreign Service and the, you know, Arabic speakers and the Mandarin speakers and people who really had served abroad and knew the U.S. governmental system, but also bringing in, you know, one of my top advisors was Human Rights Watch's Latin America, you know, documenter of so much of how the United States had been led astray in Latin America over so many generations. My deputy was a criminal defense attorney in New York who'd you know, done some of the hardest criminal defense, or, you know, representing some of the most unsavory clients in a manner that was reflective of his belief that the system was, you know, stuck. And so, you know, if you retain some self-awareness and know the peril of getting isolated in these jobs, you know, I think I'm not saying I was perfect, but that at retaining that self-awareness, but I think building those guardrails becomes important. Anyway, your question was about the present. Well, look, we are, I think I quote one of my mentors early on in the book, who says to me, like, what America does and doesn't do will turn in such large measure on the people who comprise our institutions at the highest level. And right now, it's no secret that we have people at a person at the very highest level whose ambitions are really appear to be almost exclusively those of personal, financial, and political self-enrichment, and are not based at all on the needs of the constituency that he has very successfully and effectively mobilized, namely people who feel like they're being left behind by globalization, by demographics, other things. I mean, there's nothing policy-wise that has been delivered for those individuals by this president. And the people around him, I mean, we've never had such corruption within the cabinet, so many resignations, even in an age where, you know, the president is inclined to dismiss criticism of him and the people around him as fake news. nonetheless, even in that, and even when corruption is becoming kind of normalized at the highest levels, even still, the corruption has been so egregious that we've had more resignations and more turnover in the president's cabinet than in any in history. So, and then in terms of foreign policy, it's interestingly naive. I'm the idealist, but a kind of bizarre, 18th century view of the world where there is a universe in which the United States can go it alone, when our economy is completely integrated with that of others, when our economy is dependent also on the flow of people in and out of the United States, when there's no winding back the clock on the demographic shifts that have occurred and the diversity that defines who America is. And so this kind of the lack of realism, to the approach that is being taken, and in another sort of more subtle way, this affection for strong men that the president has, and this complicated set of reasons I think that he has those affections, and this kind of almost contempt, or at least the repeated, recurrent insults of our allies and the people with whom we've sort of sank or swum over these decades. But that also, there's a lack of realism to that, because in the end, in a pinch, it's not going to be Mohammed bin Salman who's going to come to your aid, if you're in a situation and you need to build a coalition against ISIS 2.0, right? That's going to be the United Kingdom, it's going to be France, it's going to be Germany, it's going to be Canada, all the countries that Trump, seems to almost delight in sort of insulting as free riders and so forth. And so, I'm the people who are comprising our institutions are dictating the face that America presents to the world. And the reason, again, I've written the book in the way that I have is to try to also, on the other side of it, the people who are sort of sighing or throwing their shoes at the television or whatever, to say, like, if you don't like it, there's no one here but us chickens. There's no door number 2 where you get a do-over. We are going to change things and recover our better angels and hopefully take a set of decisions and initiate a set of policies that we were maybe arguably too timid to pursue or too blocked, one of the two. But that's only going to happen if people turn out. I mean, fewer women voted in 2016 than 2012, way fewer young people, and now who are paying the price, all the American people as a whole, the world, the global order, et cetera. So, it's about making people, I think, take their fates into their own hands more than perhaps we're accustomed to doing.
So we'll open it up in a few minutes. I just want to try and get through 2 or 3 more questions before we do that. Syria, I mean, you write, and it comes off the page, how painful, how conflicted, how disappointed you were about how Syria unfolded. And of course, we in Britain had our kind of part to play in it because we had our vote against action in Syria right in the middle of it, which didn't help. Was there anything that could have been done and should have been done differently in relation to Syria, and what was it? And does it really turn on the fact that the president should not, in the end, have sought congressional approval unless he was certain he could get it?
Let me just say parenthetically that I was just having coffee 5 minutes away, meeting my friend Zia, and who did I see in the lobby of the hotel just now but the head of the White Helmets, who you might remember. I tell the story of meeting with him in 2016 and in my office at the UN, and he was coming because Russia had, this is Rod Salah, and he was coming because Russia had joined Syria in bombing the living daylights out of Aleppo, and he was there to document and to show how many white helmets, these are the civil defense, the people who are rescuing people out of the rubble of these destroyed buildings, but to show how many of the white helmets themselves had been killed, and then to describe as a witness himself exactly the nature of the pulverization of civilians that was going on in Aleppo. And there's a scene in the book where I'm about to do my, always look on the bright side of life, kind of, maybe we can do this, and maybe, And I'm looking in his eyes, and here is a guy who's lost, dozens of his men just in recent days. And I'm about to say, well, if we can just get Russia to, and maybe, and then I'm just like, what am I doing? And I just stopped talking. And blah, 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 blah. There'd been so much of that in the Security Council, even internally. And he normally, when you have a guest, even one who's, bringing a message of relative desperation, there's a sort of civility or some way in which they'll bail you out of your own, impotence maybe. And he just sat there and he just stared at me. And I had nothing honest to say that would be consoling for him. So I described the scene in the book. We just stared at each other for 2 or 3 minutes, and it was one of the most haunting moments. And my counselor, who was the Human Rights Watch person, as we walked out of the meeting after, it was such a tense and terrible meeting, and he said, every person who works for the US government, the Russian government, any government who is in a position of having some influence at this moment should have to sit through a meeting like that. In other words, like to try to defend what we were doing. So, but you asked, anyway, so I just ran into him. It was the first time I'd seen him since that meeting. I ran into him just before now, and he's still here, meeting with people in the Foreign Office, trying to gin up support for civil defense for civilians, basically, in Syria. It's heartbreaking. I think that the missed opportunities start actually in the 2011 to 2013 period, where the opposition had a huge amount of momentum. Assad hadn't then decided how far he would go. I mean, he was already brutalizing his people in ever more savage ways, but you didn't have, the opposition was pretty moderate at the time. You didn't have foreign terrorist fighters who'd come into Syria who greatly complicated the picture on the ground. You might say, well, okay, that's so obvious. Obama's the guy who believes in diplomacy. Here's where this is almost banal, especially when juxtaposed with what was happening in Syria. But in that period, we were doing our back-channel negotiations with the Iranian government, with whom we'd had almost no contact for decades. And in order to bring all the stakeholders together diplomatically, Iran really needed to be at the table. But that would have been, politically just really, really difficult to get done. I mean, we saw with the Iran nuclear deal that we were able eventually to get that across the finish line, but only barely, just given sort of reflexive Republican opposition to whatever Obama would do, but then compounded by the view on both sides of the aisle that this is a toxic regime. And so I think that really hobbled the kind of the inclusive diplomacy. So there's plenty of diplomacy being done, but it wasn't of a nature that was reflecting the complexity and the range of actors on the ground. And so I don't know, again, in retrospect, whether what Congress would have done had we taken such a giant leap. But given that we made it later, it's sort of a shame that it wasn't made first for Syria. And again, it was only, John Kerry was able to bring all the stakeholders together, but that was only once you'd sort of broken the seal with the Iran deal. And then I think there's a second phase that people don't really focus on very much. Everybody focuses on the post-August 2013 period with Obama, where he said he was going to use force right after the big attack when 1,400 people were killed, gassed. And again, I tell this whole story in the book, but there actually was a year prior to that, almost a year, of small-scale chemical weapons attacks. Not large numbers of casualties, but the genie very clearly being taken out of the bottle. And there wasn't a huge amount of press focus on it. So Obama had issued his red line threat in August of 2012. The big attack is August 2013, but there's an awful lot that happens in between. And I just wonder, had there been a very robust response to even something, much more limited than the big attack that got all the attention and that caused David Cameron to go to Parliament to get support to join the United States, that could have been an effective deterrent, at least against the use of that weapon. And there's plenty to say about whether it even makes sense to sort of carve out one weapon or to sort of anoint one weapon as mattering more than others, given the amount of barrel bombs and incendiary weapons and other things that were being used as well. But actually, the chemical weapons had a profound effect on the ground, on the Syrian opposition. When Assad started to use, again, beginning in late 2012, just the fear factor of what chemical weapons could do and sort of the grotesque nature of the weapon really did have a kind of catalytic effect, for the regime. And all that meant was the more imbalance there was between the regime and the opposition, the less likely you were going to get a political settlement because the regime felt itself as having momentum. So I think that question of and then, yes, the part I talk about in the book, as you say, is, we made the same mistake, the identical mistake that David Cameron made. David Cameron went to the parliament and, in showing the unique foresight for which he's known now, but the preview of the Brexit foresight was what happened in August, I guess it was by then, late August 2013, and we watched that happen, but because we waited indeed for it to happen, like we were going, I think we were much closer to Obama actually ordering the strikes. We were hours away from it, really, and then a decision was made, well, let's give the Prime Minister his time so that we have, the biggest possible, the most legitimate coalition that we can have. It was going to be small no matter what, and then when that didn't go through, interestingly, the vulnerability of having a smaller coalition, the vulnerability of what happened to Cameron made Obama feel like he needed the sort of thicker, and so ironically, in pursuit of the thicker ballast on the front end for staging limited strikes, we ended up with, the rug being pulled out from under us altogether. And so to pursue that congressional authorization without knowing whether you have the votes, I don't think anybody can look back on that and think that that was our best moment. Now, getting congressional support should be doable. The fact that we in the United States has troops all around the world, effectively still operating under the 9/11, the rubric, the authorization from the post 9/11, effort to go after Al-Qaeda. That's crazy that our democracy has been hobbled, that our soldiers are being asked to carry these burdens without any of the kind of knowledge, never mind backing, that they deserve. So that authorization is needed, but as it happened in that moment between progressive angst about using military force in the Middle East and Republican opposition to whatever Barack Obama was going to be for, in retrospect, again, we should have known that the votes would not be forthcoming.
Great. I should just say, because we focused on Syria, that the book is also provides a vivid account of the many successes of the Obama.
Yes.
And it, for me, very powerfully challenged the kind of lazy assumption that Obama was a non-successful president in his foreign policy. But you need to read the book and the stuff around all sorts of, Sudan, Ebola, various other things to kind of get that picture. But I could sit here interviewing Ambassador Power for the next 10 hours, but my job is to bring in some questions from the room, so I will start here. Wait for the microphone to come to you. I'll take 3 questions at a time, if that's all right. Are you getting questions off Twitter?
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
First of all, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time. So I would love to know, how did you manage to keep the outsider's perspective that you had as a journalist when you became an insider, and how did you manage not to get caught up in an elitist system that employs a top-down approach to problems and isn't necessarily focused on the people that are most affected by its policies?
Okay, hold on to that one, and then we'll move back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your book. It is, as Matthew said, a really gripping read. I was struck, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there was no mention of Guantanamo in there, and I just wondered if I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and specifically Obama's decision, I think very early on, to look forwards, not back, in terms of your own views on accountability.
And then the guy in the back row there.
Thank you very much. You come from a continent originally where for over 70 years, a whole mass of states have come together either in the Council of Europe or the European Union to understand that by pooling sovereignty, you can actually gain greater clout and greater influence. That message seems to have escaped the United States for a very long time. And I just wondered if you feel there is any chance in the foreseeable future of there being a different attitude towards international treaties, whether it's on climate change, or on Iran, the International Criminal Court, in which there's a possibility that the United States might join the club, as it were, where actually solidarity internationally is of greater strength. Will it take an American recession to bring the United States to that realization?
So not easy, I know, but if you can answer those in five minutes, we can have 3 more.
Nice. Okay. If I may work backwards, just given the limits of my jet-lagged brain. So this is a great question, and I'd say one additional thing to even deepen the question about international treaties. We actually, I think, arguably will never need international treaties more than after Donald Trump, not for the reason that you say, but because the United States' credibility is so undermined in the long term, right, by having had a president, he happens to be Donald Trump, but having had a president that ripped up the Iran deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, our participation in the Paris Climate Agreement, are asking the Syrian Kurds, are effectively outsourcing the ground war against ISIS to the Syrian Kurds and then walking away from them, effectively betraying them. And so why is a treaty an answer to a set of broken promises? Because when the next president comes forward and says, okay, Iran, P5+1, let's go back to the table, let's figure out what the sort of post-Trump Iran nuclear arrangement looks like, why would anybody believe that that will be an enduring commitment on the part of the United States? And we were not able to turn the Iran, we would never have been able to turn the Iran nuclear agreement into a treaty. I mean, if we could have gotten 67 votes out of a basically roughly divided Senate, we would have preferred the 67 vote approach, just as we would have preferred that for climate. But that's not in the cards, given it's really one party's view of international treaties as a general matter. George W. Bush, I think, passed something like roughly 200, actually more, sorry, I think close to 300 international treaties. The Trump administration so far 9. Now, granted, Bush had 2 terms so even within the Republican Party, it's a kind of, it's become seen to be more politically toxic, with the rise of the Freedom Caucus and the Tea Party and so forth. So we need it more because our credibility would help lock down a set of commitments so we could persuasively say to other countries, no, actually, this will do the test of time, and yet we're less likely. The second thing I'd say, and I go a little longer on this question than the others, but is that the one occasion where you could conceive of the U.S. recognizing through enlightened self-interest that this was the right thing to do, to give something up in order to get more back from international institutions, the time where that might become more appealing is as U.S. influence in the world diminishes, which the rise of China would be bringing, that diminishment would be happening anyway, and Trump, of course, is accelerating it at a rapid pace. And yet, because of the nature, again, of social media and misinformation and propaganda, and this kind of deep-seated, and pretty long-standing trepidation about anything international or anything that curbs sovereignty, I could actually see in that phase of a kind of defensive phase where we feel relative power, diminished, becoming more, not less, nationalistic. In a way, that would mirror at the international level what's happening in both your country and my country domestically, whereas people feel their power slipping away or their clout within society, becoming, looking to blame someone. And it'll always be easy to blame the UN or to blame, some fantasy of, or some phantom of like creeping world government. And so I worry that the sensible way of thinking about the advantages of international institutions from the standpoint of moving out of a sole superpower period will not be evident to the people who can just constitute a blocking coalition. So that would be my worry. The second question started as being about Guantanamo, but then you pivoted to Obama and then not looking back. So there are two very separate things going on there. So with Guantanamo, the president had every intention of closing Guantanamo and bringing those people who had been incarcerated there to the United States. We located a maximum security prison facility. We had a plan then for integrating the detainees into a much more transparent, conventional judicial process. And Congress refused, basically, which controls the purse strings. I know this sounds crazy, but was actually able to tie the hands of the commander-in-chief, where you were physically prohibited through the budget, basically through the America's national budget, from moving anybody from Guantanamo or from paying for that facility. And it was completely surreal that as commander-in-chief, you have your intelligence agencies telling you that the maintenance of Guantanamo is a threat to national security. You are tasked under the Constitution as commander-in-chief with protecting U.S. national security, and yet through the budget, the power of the purse, a Republican-led Congress is able to prevent you from doing the thing that, even George W. Bush's national security intelligence agencies were telling him, which was that closing Guantanamo was something that would enhance U.S. security, and then keeping it open was a recruitment tool for terrorists and so forth. So that it could be that we could have moved quicker. I think that if there's recrimination, self-recrimination, it's 2009 would have been the time, 2010, but we were trying to pull the country out of this horrible economic hole and get healthcare through. And I know it sounds like you should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, but in Washington, nobody lets you do that because it's about sort of the, basically how you, who you can get to support something at a given time and a fixed amount of capital. I think your comment about not looking back had nothing, I think, had nothing to do with Guantanamo, but was about prosecution around torture that had been committed by the previous administration, rendition, deaths in custody. And I think it is a shame that, at a minimum, that we were not able to sort of, again, mobilize the kind of support we needed for significant compensation packets. I mean, even if you don't go all the way to prosecution, because you'd never have a political consensus, which, again, to set things up, you need in our divided system, at least, to be able to have shown that you're doing more than turning a page. So I share on that front your disappointment that more was not done. And I think it really, for me as somebody who's preaching international justice around the world, or to the South Sudanese, or to people who are committing horrible crimes against humanity in war, my ability to make that argument and to be heard is greatly blunted by the fact and undermined by the fact that we ourselves did not hold the people who were implicated in war crimes or in torture, accountable in the way that we recommend for other countries. And then finally, the insider-outsider, how to retain the fresh eyes and to remember the human beings at the heart of our policy process. I mentioned earlier some of the kind of people who keep you honest and making sure you surround yourself at all times by those individuals. But for me, it was really leaving the White House and going out in the world, leaving the UN, where I had more authority to plan my own trips. So when the Ebola epidemic hits West Africa, trying to line up a plane and a team to get out there so that I will be more persuasive to other countries and trying to get them to send their doctors, their health workers, their rubber gloves, their SIM cards, because I've seen the needs of those people in the field, and I just believe I'm a more informed witness, but I'm a more credible witness as well. And with trying to increase our refugee numbers, so we would take more Syrians, to spend as much time as I could, on the Turkish border in Jordanian refugee camps, actually talking to Syrian refugees, learning what their lives were like, learning what it meant not to be able to send your kids to school when they've come from these extremely educated families and communities, and just bringing that, injecting that as best I can into the policy debate, because I couldn't be everywhere at the same time. I also made an effort to bring people from the region into the Security Council, which hadn't been done near enough. So even when we were on, you mentioned the International Criminal Court earlier, in the context of international treaties, we came forward with the British government and wanted to get the crimes being carried out in Syria referred to the ICC. Russia, of course, vetoed that. But one of the things I did in that session was invited somebody who had survived a chemical weapons attack, who'd actually been left for dead, Qasim Eid, some of you know him, and invited him to the Security Council. The Russians wouldn't let him speak, but he basically offered a first-person testimony as to what he would have said if the ICC referral had gone through. If one day he'd been allowed to testify, this is what his testimony would have been at the court. And so I just read it almost as a first-person account of what the stakes were with international justice and how perpetrators were getting away with committing crimes like the kind that killed his loved ones and nearly took his life as well. And so that, again, you could talk about Syrian chemical weapons use, but then to hear a first-person account of somebody who'd been, who had a sheet over him until someone, put, some kind of shock to his system that kind of pulled him, noticed he was breathing before he was taken off to a burial. I mean, it was that dramatic, and that brings, I think, a different dimension into the discussions. It doesn't make Vladimir Putin not want to veto the resolution, but I think it turns more people around you into advocates who do have more flexibility in their instructions into, if not advocates for your cause, at least to remember the shared humanity and that these aren't abstractions of Syria this and Russia, US this. It's about someone like Qasim and what had been done to him and his community.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up the session. Thank you for coming and for your excellent questions. I'm sorry that I didn't get a chance to take more questions, but Ambassador Power will be staying on for a short while now to sign books outside in the foyer. I mean, it is an amazing book. One of my favourite parts of the book is when you decide as ambassador that you're going to do something which is completely unprecedented, which is to go and visit the other UN ambassadors, often in their very tiny offices in very small countries, and the power that has in terms of developing relationships and alliances. So it's a book full of fantastic content, so do get your copy of Education of Idealist, signed by the author outside. If you want to know more about the RSA's work, check out our website, pop downstairs to our coffee house where you'll find out more information about our current projects and how you can get involved in our own Changemaker community. But all that remains is for me to ask you to join me in thanking Ambassador Power.